Welcome to this explainer. Look, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is easily one of the most deeply debated and complex geopolitical issues of our time. It involves these incredibly intertwined questions of land, identity, and competing national aspirations. So today, we're cutting through the noise. We're going to explore the facts of this situation, strictly through the lens of international law and the documented reality on the ground.
Now this brings us to a huge question, one that really serves as the hook for our understanding. What happens when an occupation involves not just military forces, but the actual movement of civilians into a territory? Can changing the demographic reality of a region fundamentally alter its political future? In this explainer, we're going to focus specifically on the role of Israeli civilian settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories to understand exactly how this mechanism impacts the whole region.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the role of settlements, competing perspectives and claims, the real human cost, international law and diplomacy, why this issue actually matters, and finally, pathways to lasting peace. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The role of settlements.
All right, before we get into the heavy politics, we need to establish the physical reality on the ground. What actually are settlements? Well, simply put, they are residential communities established by Israeli civilians in the West Bank, and that includes East Jerusalem. We're not just talking about a few houses here. Today, this encompasses hundreds of thousands of individuals living across over 100 recognized communities and outposts. It's this massive, deeply rooted geographic footprint that literally reshapes the landscape.
And right here is where we hit the core friction. Who actually owns this land? Israel views these territories as disputed, meaning they believe the final status has to be hammered out through direct negotiations, so they reject any unilateral assumptions about ownership. On the flip side, you have many Palestinians, the United Nations, and the vast majority of global governments who regard these settlements as being built on occupied territory, which they argue goes strictly against international law. You really have to understand this foundational divide to grasp why this issue remains so incredibly stubborn.
Moving on to Section 2, Competing Perspectives and Claims.
Let's look at the two sides of the coin here. Critics are incredibly concerned that expanding these settlements completely changes the demographics, fractures Palestinian communities, and frankly, leaves a lot less land for any contiguous, connected Palestinian state in the future. But on the other hand, supporters will point to really deep historical and religious ties to the land. Plus, they highlight major security needs, arguing that maintaining a civilian and military presence there is absolutely crucial for strategic depth and that final borders have to be determined through active negotiations, not predetermined assumptions.
Section 3. The real human cost.
We have to step away from the abstract politics for a second, because on the ground, the daily burden on ordinary people is just immense. For Palestinians, we're talking about frequent evictions, really tight restrictions on building permits, limited road access, and constant land disputes that just stifle economic stability and tear apart families. And right alongside that, Israeli civilians are living with the constant threat of violence, armed attacks, and this really deep-seated fear and mistrust that permeates everyday life. It is just a relentless cycle of uncertainty for everyone living within it.
And here's the thing, empathy cannot be a one-way street. Acknowledging the suffering of civilians on all sides is a strict prerequisite if we're going to have any meaningful discussion about this. You simply can't understand the high-level geopolitical chess game taking place in capitals around the world without first recognizing the profound mistrust, the interrupted lives, and the very real fears of the actual human beings on the ground.
All right, Section 4, International Law and Diplomacy.
So, zooming back out to the macro level, what does international law actually say about all this? Well, the legal landscape is highly contested. Major bodies like the UN and the International Court of Justice have formally concluded that Israeli settlements are inconsistent with international law, viewing them as a violation of conventions regarding occupied territories. But Israel actively disputes those interpretations. They stand firm that these highly complex historical and territorial issues can only be solved by the two parties sitting down and negotiating directly, not by outside mandates. And that fundamental disagreement, it leaves global diplomats totally caught in the middle.
Section 5. Why this issue matters.
Now, you might be wondering, why is this specific issue of housing the linchpin for the whole region's future? Well, settlement expansion impacts literally everything. It dictates everyday freedom of movement. It decides who gets access to really scarce resources like water and agricultural land, which obviously drives regional economic development. And most importantly, where these communities are physically placed fundamentally alters the viability of future borders and peace negotiations. Analysts pretty much universally agree, if we don't untangle these deeply intertwined factors, achieving a lasting peace is nearly impossible.
Which brings us to Section 6, Pathways to Lasting Peace.
Look, there is no single magic bullet here, but the source material does point to a really comprehensive framework for how to move forward. It starts with renewed, good-faith negotiations, heavily backed by international diplomacy. On the ground, it requires protecting civilians by strictly complying with international humanitarian law and addressing these settlement disputes transparently. It also means strengthening accountability, supporting basic humanitarian needs like housing and healthcare, and honestly, maybe the most crucial part, encouraging grassroots dialogue to build understanding directly between Israeli and Palestinian communities to slowly start bridging that divide.
Because at the end of the day, a conflict like this cannot be understood through slogans alone. The ultimate question is, will leaders and citizens commit to the really difficult compromises and the mutual recognition required to actually see the humanity in everyone affected? Lasting peace requires listening to history and respecting international law for sure. But ultimately, it demands dialogue, justice, and accountability for both Palestinians and Israelis. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.